The wolf was already there when Mirela opened the door. She had not heard him arrive. She had not heard a single sound from the porch all night, and yet there he was, sitting directly in front of her door like a statue carved from pale stone, enormous and perfectly still, his silver coat catching the early gray light of a morning that had not yet decided whether it would be kind or cruel. His amber eyes were fixed on her face with an attention that was almost uncomfortable. Not threatening. Not desperate. Simply certain, the way a river is certain of where it is going. Mirela stood in the doorway with a basket of dried herbs under her arm and stared at him. He did not move. She took one step forward and he held his ground. She said, firmly, in the voice she used for goats that wandered into her vegetable rows, that he needed to go on. She pointed down the mountain path. He looked at her hand, then looked back at her face. He did not move. She went around him. She did her morning work. She checked her garden, tied back the climbing sage that had come loose in the night wind, collected 2 eggs from the small coop behind the cottage, and came back to find him lying across the bottom step of her porch with his chin resting on his front paws, watching her return with the calm patience of something that had made a decision and was not reconsidering it. That was how it started. Mirela Voss was 26 years old and had lived alone in the stone cottage at the foot of the Grey Vale Mountains for almost a year. Before that, she had lived there with her mother, who had taught her how to press roots for medicine and dry flowers for tea and speak honestly to anyone who came to her door in pain. Her mother had died in late autumn the year before, quietly, in her sleep, and had left Mirela the cottage, the garden, the knowledge, and a loneliness so large that some mornings it filled the whole room before Mirela had even gotten out of bed. She was not a woman who drew attention. She was small and dark-haired and tended to speak softly and listen loudly. The people of Grey Vale Village, a 40-minute walk down the mountain path, came to her for remedies and tonics. She charged what people could give, which meant she sometimes received bread and sometimes received nothing and rarely received coin, but her garden was generous and her needs were few, and she had made a kind of peace with her small life. A cautious peace. The kind that holds its breath. She had not told anyone about the creek. 3 weeks before the wolf appeared at her door, Mirela had walked out in the dead of night to the frozen creek at the northern edge of her property. She had not gone there to gather water or to check the ice. She had gone there because the grief that winter had been building inside her had finally grown heavier than she was, and she had wanted to stand at the edge of something cold and final and let the weight of it settle without anyone watching. She had not planned to fall in. But she had slipped on the ice at the bank, gone under the surface with a shock that knocked the air clean out of her chest, and in the seconds that followed, something large and warm had plunged into the creek after her. She had felt herself grabbed, held, dragged, not roughly, but with an unstoppable steadiness, and pulled up onto the snowy bank, coughing and gasping in the dark. She had been too stunned to see clearly. There had been a silver shape, enormous, close, warm against her frozen side. And then it was gone. She had crawled back to the cottage and stripped off her wet clothes and sat shaking by the fire for an hour before her hands stopped trembling enough to hold a cup of tea. She had told herself it was a dog. A very large dog. She had told herself many things that night, mostly to avoid thinking about the particular moment just before she fell, when she had stood at the edge and thought, clearly and quietly, that she was tired of being so alone in a world that did not seem to notice she was in it. The wolf had arrived 3 weeks after that. He came back the next morning too. And the morning after. On the 4th day, Mirela brought a bowl of water out and set it beside the step. She did not know why. She told herself it was because she had once been kind to a stray dog as a child and old habits are hard to argue with. The wolf lowered his head to the bowl, drank slowly, and then raised his eyes to her face with an expression that was too specific to be animal and too quiet to be anything she had a word for. By the end of the first week, the people of Grey Vale had noticed. Old Percy Hatch was the first to mention it at the market, loudly enough for 6 people to hear. He said he had passed the cottage road the day before and seen the wolf lying on the porch like it owned the place, and that it was not a natural thing. He said the wolf was the size of a small horse. He said nobody's dog grew that big. He said, lowering his voice only a little, that everyone knew what the Alpha King could do, and that wolf had the silver coat and the amber eyes and the old markings of the wolf bloodline, which had ruled the Northern Pack territory for 4 generations and whose alpha could shift between man and beast at will. People listened. People talked. Within 2 days the story had grown in the telling until half the village believed Mirela had somehow called the wolf to her door, and the other half believed the wolf had come for reasons they did not understand but deeply wanted to. Mirela heard none of this directly. But she felt the shift in how people looked at her when she came down the mountain to trade. There were longer pauses before people answered her. There were eyes that moved to the mountain path behind her and then came back to her face with questions they did not ask out loud. She went home that evening and sat on the porch step beside the wolf and told him, honestly, that he was complicating her life. He rested his head against her knee. She felt the warmth of him move through the cold evening air like a held breath. She did not push him away. She did not understand what was happening. She understood even less why the part of herself that had stood at the creek 3 weeks ago and felt entirely alone did not feel that way anymore. She did not have language for that yet. But it was there. Underneath the confusion and the village gossip and the weight of a grief she had not yet finished carrying, something had shifted. Something small, like a window cracked open on a cold day. Just enough to let a little air in. The wolf closed his amber eyes in the fading light. Mirela pulled her shawl tighter and stayed where she was. Down in the village, the talking did not stop. It was just beginning. And 60 miles north, in a stone hall built on the crest of a ridge that looked out over the entire Northern Territory, a man sat at a long table covered in maps and border documents and reports he had not been able to read clearly in 3 weeks, because every time he picked up a page, his mind went south. He set the papers down again. He pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose. His wolf, the ancient and powerful instinct that had lived inside him since the day he was born into the wolf bloodline, did not say anything. It never used words. It simply pulled, the way a compass needle pulls north, except this pull went south and slightly west and would not stop regardless of how firmly he told it to. He had fought it for 3 weeks. He had sent it into silence with sheer will more times than he could count. He had thrown himself into border negotiations and pack council meetings and the 100 daily tasks of ruling a territory that covered half a mountain range. None of it helped. His name was Darien Wolf. He was 31 years old. He had been Alpha King of the Northern Pack territory since he was 20, when his father had died and left him a kingdom in the middle of a territorial dispute that took him 4 years to resolve. He was not a man given to losing control of himself. His elder council said he was the most disciplined alpha in 4 generations, which was meant as a compliment and which Darien had accepted as one. He was not supposed to be thinking about a herbalist in a mountain cottage. He was not supposed to feel anything he could not explain. He was absolutely not supposed to have a wolf that refused every command and kept its attention fixed on a woman who did not even know his name. He sat in the stone hall with the maps spread out in front of him and the fire burning low and the whole weight of the Northern Territory resting on his shoulders. And his wolf pulled south. And south. And south. Darien did not tell anyone where he was going. He told his chief advisor, a careful man named Owen who had served his father before him, that he was making a circuit of the southern border villages. This was not entirely untrue. The southern villages were on the border. He would be passing through the region. He simply did not mention that he was going in the shape of a wolf, or that the specific village he intended to reach was a 40-minute walk from a stone cottage at the foot of the Greyvale Mountains, or that the woman inside that cottage had no idea he existed. He shifted on the northern ridge at dawn, when the sky was still gray and no one was watching, and ran south through the pine forest with the cold air moving through his coat and the ground firm under his feet, and for the first time in 3 weeks his mind stopped fighting itself and simply moved. He reached the mountain path by mid-morning. He reached the cottage by noon. She was in the garden, kneeling in the frost-hard soil beside a row of winter herbs, pulling something loose from the ground with careful hands. She did not hear him coming. She was humming something soft and tuneless under her breath. She looked entirely ordinary and entirely herself, and his wolf, which had been pulling and pulling and pulling for 21 days, went perfectly, completely still. He sat down outside her gate. He waited. She turned around eventually, and saw him, and her face moved through surprise and then recognition and then something complicated that settled into a kind of resigned patience, and she said, out loud and to no one in particular, that he was back. He was. He intended to stay. Darian spent 3 hours outside her gate that first afternoon, shifting back to his human form in the cover of the pine trees when the light began to fail, and walking back toward the village road before anyone could see him emerging from the mountain path. He told himself this was a temporary arrangement. He told himself he was simply observing. He told himself that once he understood the bond, once he could explain it to his council in clear terms, he would handle it properly and everything would return to normal. His wolf did not find any of this convincing. He came back the next day. And the next. On the 4th day, he arrived in human form, walking up the mountain path in plain clothes without a crest or a guard or anything that announced him as anything other than a man taking a morning walk. He stood at the bottom of the path and looked at the cottage and felt the pull in his chest like a hand pressed flat against his ribs. He turned around and walked back to the village. He was not ready. He was not sure what ready would feel like. He bought a cup of tea at the village market stall and sat on a low wall and watched Greyvale go about its morning. He heard 2 women talking nearby about the wolf on the herbalist's porch. He heard the word witchcraft. He heard the word strange. He heard Mirela's name spoken with a particular kind of caution that made his jaw tighten. He finished his tea. He set the cup down carefully. He walked back up the mountain path. He knocked on the cottage door. She opened it. She looked at him. Her eyes were dark and direct and not at all frightened, and she said, simply, "Can I help you?" He said his name. Her face went very still. He said, quietly, that he thought they needed to talk. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped back and held the door open and let him in. Outside, on the step, the silver wolf that was also a king and also a man's oldest self lay down in the weak afternoon sun and closed his eyes. For the first time in 3 weeks, the pulling stopped. Not because the bond was broken. Because he was finally, exactly where he was supposed to be. The inside of the cottage smelled like dried herbs and wood smoke and something faintly sweet that Darian could not identify. There were bundles of plants hanging from the ceiling beams. There were small jars lined up on the window ledge with handwritten labels. There was a single chair by the fire and a low table and a rug worn soft from years of use, and everything in the room was modest and purposeful and had the particular calm of a space that had been lived in quietly for a long time. Mirela did not offer him the chair. She sat down on a low stool near the fire and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with the steady attention of someone who had decided to be honest regardless of what came next. He stood near the door. He was not sure, for a moment, how to begin. He had given speeches to councils and resolved disputes between pack leaders and faced down challenges to his authority without flinching, and now he was standing in a small cottage in front of a woman he did not know and he had no idea how to arrange his words. He began with the creek. He told her what he had seen from the ridge 3 weeks before he had come to her door. He told her he had come down the mountain because something had felt wrong in the dark, which was not something he could explain precisely but which he had learned not to ignore. He told her about the ice in the water and what he had done without stopping to think about it, which was to go in. Mirela was very quiet while he spoke. Her hands did not move. Her face did not change in any dramatic way. She simply listened, and when he finished she said, in a voice that was level and careful, that she had not known it was him. He said he had known that. She said she had thought it was a dog. He said he understood. She was quiet again. Then she said that she supposed she owed him her life. She said it simply, without any particular weight on it, like a fact being noted. He said she did not owe him anything. He said he had not told her this to create a debt. He said he had told her because she deserved to know the truth of what had happened, and because there was more she needed to hear, and he was not going to say any of it unless she wanted him to continue. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Continue." He told her about the bond. He told her that among people like him, people of the old bloodlines who carried the shifting gift, there was a connection that sometimes formed without permission or planning. He told her it was called the bond, which was a plain name for something that was not plain at all. He told her it formed between a shifter and a human when the human became, in some deep and specific way, necessary to the shifter's survival. Not necessary in the way food or water was necessary. Necessary in the way that certain things could anchor a person to their own life when the current was moving too fast. He told her it had formed the night he pulled her from the creek. Mirela looked at the fire for a moment. Then she looked back at him. She asked what it meant. Not in an alarmed way. In a genuinely wanting to understand way. He said that for him, it meant that his wolf had been unable to go anywhere else. That for 3 weeks his instinct had been pulling him south every hour of the day, and that when he was in wolf form, he had not been able to stay away from her door. He said that he had tried. He said this with a kind of plain honesty that cost him something, because Darien Wolf did not generally admit to failing at things. He said it was not something he controlled. It was not something he had chosen. But he was not going to pretend it was not happening, and he was not going to keep showing up at her door in a shape that could not explain itself without giving her the truth first. Mirela was quiet for so long that he thought she might ask him to leave. Then she said, carefully and without looking away from the fire, that she had something to tell him too. She told him about the night at the creek. Not the part where she fell. The part before it. She told him why she had gone there, and what she had been thinking, and how the weight of the year had built and built until she had walked out into the dark with no particular plan except to stand somewhere final and cold. She told him that the silver shape in the dark had arrived before she slipped. That it had been there in the trees on the bank, still and watching, and that something about its presence had moved through her like a sound she could hear in her bones. She had turned to look at it. She had taken a step toward it. And she had slipped. But she said, very quietly, that she did not think she had been going to let herself fall. She thought the shape in the dark had changed something just before she slipped. She thought she had already decided, in those few seconds before the ice gave way, to turn around and go back to the cottage. She said she was not sure. She had never been sure. But she wanted him to know it, because he had told her the truth and she was going to do the same. Darien sat down on the floor beside the fire. He did not say anything for a while. His elder counsel had told him the bond formed when the human became necessary to the shifter's survival. But it worked in both directions. A bond of that kind, they had said, only formed when the connection was real on both sides. When something passed between two people that changed the shape of what was possible for each of them. He looked at Mirela. She looked back at him. Outside, on the step, the wolf did not move. The fire made its small and steady sound. And something that had been held tightly for a very long time began, very carefully, to loosen. Word moved fast in small places. By the time Darien walked back down the mountain path that afternoon, 3 different people in the lower village had already seen a tall gray-eyed man come down the road from the direction of the herbalist's cottage. By evening, someone had noticed that the man had not come through the village on the way up. By the following morning, old Percy Hatch had said, loudly enough for 12 people to hear this time, that the Alpha King's envoy horses were silver gray, which was the same color as the wolf on the cottage step, which was the same color as the coat on the man who had walked down from the mountain with the specific bearing of someone who did not walk anywhere without a reason. Old Percy was not a subtle man. But he was not wrong. The village of Greyvale had known for generations that it sat inside the Northern Pack territory. They had known the name Wolf the way they knew the name of the mountain, as something large and permanent that shaped the land around them without necessarily coming close. They had paid their territorial dues and observed the old customs and lived their lives in the way that people do when something powerful exists nearby but mostly leaves them alone. The idea that the Alpha King's wolf had been sleeping on a local herbalist's porch for weeks was not a small thing. It was, in fact, a very large thing. And Greyvale handled large things the way most small places do, which was to talk about them constantly until the edges wore down and something like understanding, or at least familiarity, could settle in. Mirela was aware of none of this in any direct way, but she felt it. She felt it in the way conversations shifted when she arrived at the market. She felt it in the particular quality of silence that followed her down the lanes. She felt it in the face of Ada Ferris, who ran the bread stall and who had always been kind to her, and who now looked at her with an expression that sat somewhere between admiration and worry. Mirela did not adjust her behavior. She had spent her life being looked at sideways by people who found her existence slightly unusual, and she had developed a quiet steadiness in the face of it. She came to market. She traded her remedies. She walked home up the mountain path with her basket and her bread and the particular stillness of a person who has decided not to borrow trouble from a future that had not arrived yet. But things were arriving. 3 days after Darian's first visit to the cottage, a group of 4 men came up the mountain path at dusk. They were not violent men in any meaningful sense. They were men who had been sitting together all afternoon telling each other that something needed to be done about the situation, and who had drunk enough to believe that they were the right people to do it. They came up the path with the half-formed intention of removing the wolf by whatever means seemed most practical. They reached the cottage gate. The wolf was on the step. He turned his head and looked at them. None of them moved. He did not growl. He did not stand. He did not show his teeth or shift his weight or do anything that could be called aggressive. He simply looked at them with his amber eyes and held their gaze for a long, specific moment, and something in the quality of that attention moved through all 4 men like cold water. They stood at the gate for perhaps 30 seconds. Then, without speaking to each other or deciding anything out loud, they turned around and walked back down the path. One of them later said he did not know what had stopped him. He said it was not fear exactly. He said it was more like the feeling of standing at the edge of something very deep and being made suddenly, completely aware of how small you were by comparison. Mirela did not know about the men at the gate until Ada Ferris told her 2 days later, carefully and with a great deal of visible discomfort. Ada said she thought Mirela ought to know. Ada said she was not one of those who thought there was anything wrong with the situation, but she was worried, and she thought Mirela should be careful. Mirela thanked her. She walked home. She sat on the step beside the wolf for a long time. She said, to the wolf and to the darkening mountain and to herself, that she did not know what was going to happen. The wolf rested his head against her arm. She said she was not going to pretend she was not frightened. He was still. She said she was also not going to leave her cottage or her garden or her life because other people were uncomfortable, because she had already left too much of herself in too many directions trying to take up less space, and she was done with that. The wolf exhaled slowly in the cooling air. Mirela put her hand on his neck, in the thick warm fur just below his jaw, and felt the steady beat of something alive and enormous and entirely present, and breathed. 2 days later, the royal envoy arrived. They came down the main village road in the early afternoon with 6 horses and a formal banner and a calm efficiency that made everyone stop what they were doing. The lead rider, a composed man in his 40s with a dark coat and a wax seal on his jacket, stopped at the village square and announced that the Alpha King of the Northern Pack territory would be conducting a regional review of the Greyvale district within the week and that the village elder should prepare for a formal meeting. People listened. People looked at the horses. The lead horse was silver gray. Old Percy Hatch said nothing at all. He just nodded slowly, in the way of a man who has been right about something and finds it more solemn than satisfying. Up on the mountain, Mirela had not heard any of this yet. She was in the cottage pressing roots when a knock came at the door. She opened it. Darian stood on the step in plain clothes again, without the wolf, without a guard, without any of the particular weight that should have come with a man of his position. He looked like someone who had walked a long way and thought about things the whole time and arrived with fewer answers than he had started with. He said he had something to tell her before someone else did. She stepped back. She let him in. He sat in the chair by the fire this time, because she pointed at it and he was not going to argue with her in her own cottage. She took the stool. She folded her hands. She waited. He told her about the envoy. He told her about the formal visit. He told her that he had not planned it this way, that the territorial review was something his council had scheduled weeks ago and that its timing now was unfortunate, because it meant that whatever was happening between them, whatever this was about to become public in a way that he could not control and had not chosen. He said he was sorry for that. He said he wanted her to know before it happened. Mirela listened. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him what he wanted. Not what the bond required. Not what his council expected. What he wanted. He was quiet for longer than she expected. Then he said, in a voice that was careful and specific, that he wanted to come back. He wanted to sit on her porch and drink bad tea and learn the names of all the plants in her garden and understand what was in the small jars on the window ledge. He wanted to be near her without it being a crisis or a political event or something that needed to be managed. He wanted time, which was the one thing his position made most difficult to have. Mirela looked at the fire. Then she looked at him. She said that she had spent a year being alone in a way that had nearly killed her, and that she was not going to pretend that what had been happening over the past few weeks had not changed something. She said she did not know what that something was yet. She said she thought honesty was the only way through something like this, and that if he could manage to be honest with her, she could manage to be patient with whatever came next. She said one more thing. She said that she was not anyone's story to tell. That if this became public, she would not be handled or explained or made into a symbol of anything. She would simply be herself, and he would need to be prepared for that to be enough. He looked at her. He said it was more than enough. Outside, somewhere on the mountain above the cottage, the wolf that was also him lifted his head and breathed in the cold air of a late afternoon that smelled like pine and frost and something changing, and did not pull south anymore. It was already here. The formal visit arrived on a Wednesday. Darian came down the ridge road with his council and his guard in full view of the village at 9 in the morning, which meant that every single person in Greyvale was already watching when he arrived. He met with the village elder in the square, a careful and measured meeting that covered territorial dues and road conditions and winter supply routes, and which lasted exactly as long as it needed to and no longer. Then he walked up the mountain path. He did not ask permission. He did not send a messenger ahead. He simply walked up the path in the plain view of the entire village, which had mostly stopped pretending to do other things and was simply watching, and he knocked on the cottage door. Mirela opened it. She had known he was coming. He had sent a note the day before, a plain piece of folded paper with no seal on it, which had arrived via a very ordinary-looking young man who had pressed it into her hand at the market without saying a word. The note said Wednesday morning, if you are willing. She had written back, on the same paper, just the word yes, and sent it back with the same young man. She was not dressed for a formal occasion. She was wearing her work clothes and her hair was twisted back and she had flour on one hand from the bread she had been making when she heard the knock. She did not change any of this. She stepped back and let him in. His council stayed at the bottom of the path. His guard stayed at the gate. Darian came inside alone, and the door closed behind him, and in the village below every person standing in the square exchanged a look with every other person standing in the square and said nothing, because sometimes the weight of a moment is too large for words. Inside the cottage, Mirela poured tea. She did not do it because she was nervous or because she needed something to do with her hands. She did it because tea was what she offered people who came to her door, and she was not going to treat this any differently than anything else. She handed him a cup. He took it. She sat on her stool. He sat in the chair. They were quiet for a moment with the fire going and the cottage smelling of wood smoke and herbs and the bread still baking, and then she asked him how the village meeting had gone. He told her. She asked good questions. He answered them. They talked, plainly and without performance, about the territory and the winter stores and the road conditions on the southern pass, and it was the most normal conversation Darian had had in what felt like a very long time. After a while, she asked him what happened next. He said he did not know exactly. He said his council would want to formalize things, which was the word they would use for making everything official and documented and politically comprehensible. He said that he was prepared to deal with his council. He was less sure how to handle what the village thought, or what she wanted the shape of her life to look like going forward, or any of the practical details of a situation that had no clear precedent. Mirela said she was not moving from her cottage. He said he had not asked her to. She said she was keeping her garden and her work and her independence. He said of course. She said she wanted him to understand that agreeing to see what this was did not mean agreeing to become something else. She was going to remain herself. If that was compatible with whatever his life looked like, then they could find out together. If it was not, then they needed to know that now. He said, looking at her with the same steady attention the wolf always had, that he had not come this far and told her all the true things to ask her to be anything other than what she was. She looked at him. She said, all right. The bread finished baking. She got up and cut 2 pieces and brought them to the fire, and they ate them plain with a little salt, which was not the kind of meal a king was supposed to eat on a formal regional visit, and which was, for that reason, the best meal Darian had eaten in a very long time. The news moved through the territory in the way that significant things do, which is not in one clean wave but in many overlapping ripples that reach different places at different times and get interpreted differently at every stop along the way. Some people heard that the Alpha King had taken a wife. This was not accurate. Some people heard that the Alpha King had been bound against his will by a mountain witch. This was also not accurate and considerably more dramatic. Some people heard, from sources close to the council, the actual facts of the matter, which were that a rare and involuntary bond had formed between the Alpha King and a herbalist named Mirela Voss who lived in the Greyvale Mountain District, that this bond was documented in the old records and was considered one of the most genuine and unmanipulable connections known among their kind, and that the Alpha King had chosen to honor it rather than attempt to break it. This last version took longer to travel and was less exciting than the others, but it was the one that lasted. Within the Northern Pack territory itself, the reaction was divided along lines that were more about temperament than politics. Those who valued tradition were reassured by the old records and by the seriousness with which Darian had handled everything. Those who were suspicious of anything they did not fully understand took longer to come around. Those who simply wanted the Alpha King to be happy, which was a category that included a larger portion of the territory than any of them would have admitted out loud, found themselves feeling something close to relief. In Greyvale, the gossip completed its natural cycle and began to settle into something that resembled acceptance. Mirela's life did not change dramatically. She still came to market. She still traded her remedies. Ada Ferris at the bread stall stopped looking at her with that worried expression and started looking at her with something that was slightly warmer, though she never said anything about it directly. Old Percy Hatch said, to anyone who would listen, that he had known from the beginning that the wolf was the Alpha King's, which was mostly true and which he had earned the right to say. Darian came back on the following Saturday, without ceremony, in plain clothes, and asked if he could help in the garden. Mirela looked at him. She handed him a pair of worn leather gloves that had belonged to her mother. He put them on and knelt in the frost-hard soil beside her, and she told him what to pull up and what to leave, and he followed instructions without arguing, which she found genuinely surprising and which she decided to consider a promising sign. They worked until midday. She made soup. He stayed for it. He left in the early afternoon, walking back down the mountain path the same way he had arrived, unremarkable and unguarded, and the village watched him go with the particular quiet of people who had decided something was real. This became the rhythm of things. He came when he could. She did not rearrange her life around his schedule, and he did not ask her to. He learned the names of the plants in her garden over several weeks, not all at once. He learned what the small jars on the window ledge contained, one by one, which she taught him in her mother's matter-of-fact way, as though the knowledge was simply useful, which it was. He told her about the territory, about the work of running something large and complicated, about the parts of it that were genuinely hard. She listened well. She asked good questions. She told him when she thought he was wrong about something, which happened more often than he expected, and which he found he did not mind in the way he would have minded it from anyone else. His elder council watched all of this with varying degrees of unease. Owen, the chief advisor, came to him after the third Saturday visit and said, carefully, that the situation needed to be formalized at some point. Darian said yes. Owen asked when. Darian said when it was time. Owen said, with the patience of a man who had been advising leaders for 30 years, that the territory needed clarity. Darian said the territory would have it. He did not say when. What he did not tell Owen, and what he was still working out for himself, was that for the first time in 11 years of ruling, he was not managing this. He was not handling it or resolving it or bringing it to a clean conclusion. He was simply in it, the way you are simply in weather, and he was finding that being in something without controlling it was both more frightening and more genuine than anything he had allowed himself in a very long time. Mirela, for her part, was finding something similar. She was finding that the particular loneliness that had been building in her all year, the kind that she had carried to the edge of the creek on a dark winter night, had been replaced by something that was not yet happiness exactly but was much closer to it than she had believed she was going to get. Not because Darian was everything or solved everything or fixed the difficult parts of her life, because he did not and she had not asked him to. But because there was now, in the morning when she woke up and in the evening when the fire was low and in all the ordinary hours of a day lived simply, the knowledge that she was not as alone as she had been. That someone knew her exact location in the world and would walk up a mountain path on a Saturday to be in it with her. That was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything. The wolf came sometimes too. Not every day anymore. He came when Darian could not be there in human form, which happened during difficult weeks of council sessions and territorial matters. He would appear at the gate in the early evening and settle on the step, and Mirela would open the door and set a blanket on the porch boards and sit beside him with a book or her pressing work, and they would be there together in the dark and the cold and the particular piece of two things that had found each other in a situation neither of them had planned. She never asked him to come back in the form that could explain itself. He always did, when he was able. The bond, the elder council eventually confirmed in their formal written assessment, was genuine and complete and could not be manufactured or coerced and was, by every measure they had, one of the most documented and verifiable such connections in the territory's recorded history. They noted this with the careful neutrality of people who were surprised by things they had not expected and were trying to remain professional about it. Darian filed their report and sent it to the territorial archive. Then he walked up the mountain path. It was a Sunday this time, not a Saturday. He had not sent a note. He just came. Mirela was in the garden. She looked up when she heard the gate. She did not say anything. She just moved over slightly in the row she was working in and handed him the spare gloves without being asked. He knelt down beside her in the cold soil. He started pulling up exactly what she had shown him was right to pull. Above them the mountain was white and the sky was the color of clean water and the garden smelled of cold earth and something green underneath it trying quietly to begin again. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Neither of them needed to. The wolf had refused to leave the cottage because some things, once they find their direction, will not be argued with and will not be moved by reason or difficulty or the opinions of anyone watching from a distance. He had sat on that step through cold mornings and village gossip and the discomfort of a king who did not know how to need something, and he had waited. He had waited because she was worth waiting for. And she had let him stay because, somewhere underneath the grief and the loneliness and the long year of learning to survive herself, she had known, from the first morning she opened the door and found him there, that something had arrived that was not going to leave her the way everything else had. And she was right. She was completely right. The whole territory found out eventually. The village already knew. The elder council had written it down. The old records confirmed it. The rumors settled into truth, and the truth settled into the ordinary, and the ordinary turned out to be this: a woman in a mountain cottage with flour on her hands and a garden full of winter herbs, and a man who walked up a long path to be near her, and a wolf who had known before either of them did that this was where home was. Not because they were destined. Not because the bond had forced it. But because she had stood at the edge of something final one dark winter night and turned around, and he had been in the water beside her before he even decided to go in, and between those two moments something had passed that could not be unnamed and could not be undone. It simply was. The way real things simply are. And that, in the end, was the whole of the secret. It had never been mysterious. It had only been true.